Thank you very much. My name is Les Field. I'm the Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of New South Wales, and I would very much like to welcome you here to this lecture that we have this evening as part of our Global Challenges series. We recognise at UNSW that universities play many roles, as well as being places of higher learning and research. We also do much more, particularly being part of the community and being part of society. One of the priorities we have at UNSW is to provide a forum and a focus for thought leadership and for debate. Last year, we introduced at UNSW the concept of grand challenges, that we would run a number of grand challenges which would act as focal points for public discussion around the university, engagement with the community. So far, we've got 3 grand challenges underway, one on climate change, which has been running now for about a year, one on migrants and refugees, of which this lecture is a part, and we have just kicked off another grand challenge on inequality. And you will see the concept of inequality or the scope of that grand challenge unfold over the next month or two, but that will be the 3rd of our grand challenges. The idea is that we will probably have 4 or 5 of these running concurrently, and we'll kick another one off sometime in 2017. But the idea is that we will have a number of events around each of these grand challenges in the university, in the city, where we can foster public debate, public commentary. We will have lectures, we will have seminars, we will have discussion points. And it is terrific that we've been able to get Dr. Volker Türk here this evening to be a focal point for our grand challenge. By way of introduction, Dr. Türk is the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. By my reckoning, this makes him one of the most senior members of the UNHCR. He reports directly to the Commissioner. He has previously served as the Director of the Division of International Protection from 2009 to 2015. From 2008 till 2009, he was Director for Organisational Development and Management in Geneva, leading the UNHCR's structural and management change process. From 2004 to 2008, he occupied various positions in many parts of the world, including in Malaysia, in Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Kuwait. From 2000 to 2004, he was Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice Section at the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva, which had particular responsibilities for global consultation. Prior to his time at the UNHCR, Volker Türk worked as University Assistant at the Institute of International Law at the University of Vienna, where he finished his doctoral thesis on UNHCR and its mandate. Between 1985 and 1988, he was research assistant at the Institute of Criminal Law at the University of Linz in Austria. He has published very widely on the topics of international refugee and human rights law. Without any further ado, let me invite to the podium to deliver the lecture this evening Dr. Volker Türk. His topic is A Minor Miracle, the New Global Compact on Refugees.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the University of New South Wales in this beautiful city, Sydney, and very grateful to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, very grateful to Professor Jane McAdam for hosting this event, for giving us a chance to have an exchange about some of the global challenges that we face today, which are very much related to refugees and migrant movements and forced displacement more generally. Also, I must say I'm very happy to be here, not least because of the Calder Center that was founded at the University of New South Wales in 2013. And I must say the type of institutions like the Calder Center are probably more needed than ever before, given its focus on human mobility and in particular refugee and migration issues. I'm also pleased to be here in Australia. It's a country that has a long tradition of immigration. It also has a long tradition of support for refugees when it comes to resettlement, for example, or when it comes to its special humanitarian programs. Australia was one of the first founding members and an active member of UNHCR's Executive Committee. It's a much valued donor responding to some of the most critical needs that refugees face around the world. It's also been very active in regional processes as a co-host of the Bali process, for example. I've also always been impressed, and I see a number of representatives here, by the dynamism of Australia's civil society and its academic communities. I think you have made, over the years, extremely valuable contributions to global policy on forced displacement, on refugee issues, and migration issues, and I think they're heard and seen throughout the world. From my vantage point of following global protection developments, I also have to say a couple of things about Australia itself and the domestic asylum system, because it is no secret that we have had our concerns with that system, especially over the last couple of years. And it seems to me, especially from the benefit of distance, from the benefit of having to deal with the magnitude, scope, and complexity of forced displacement, that within the public debate, there seems to be an almost disproportionate attention given to one particular mode of arrival, people coming by sea, trying to reach Australia's shores. And I'm not in any way wanting to diminish the need to save lives at sea. That's obviously very important. Or to look and address and combat human smuggling and trafficking. But at the same time, this focus on the particular aspects of those who arrive by sea has led to a very strong deterrence and border protection policy in the country. And this has most directly affected the plight of asylum seekers and refugees who seek safety by sea. And there seems to have been the emergence of a bipartisan approach within the society that, in a way, focuses on deterrence, focuses on interceptions, on offshore processing arrangements, but also on policies on shore that have resulted in prolonged delays in processing and only provided temporary protection for refugees. We know that some of these measures have had a profoundly detrimental impact on refugees, especially on their well-being, especially those who are held on Manus Island or in Nauru. We know that it has also now implicated the international community, given the humanitarian imperative. And I must say, an overstretched humanitarian community, as we will see when we talk about some of the global displacement issues. What I've also find wanting, what has been lost in the narrative, in the public debate is, and these are certainly very complex issues, is a sense of humanity and empathy for the individual human being that is caught up in conflict and tries to seek safety. Refugees who by definition that's the very definition of them, are fleeing problems. They are fleeing precarious circumstances. They have almost been turned into the problem. And as a result, barriers have been raised to prevent them from arriving on shore. And if one looks at refugeehood, there is no right or wrong way to come to a country. Refugees are refugees. They are in a precarious situation. They live in a predicament. There is no mode of arrival that should dictate what type of responses we have. They all are looking for a better life. They are looking first and foremost for safety, but also for a future. And they are refugees. They are the ones who actually flee violence and conflict and human rights abuses. If one were to take this approach to its logical conclusion and were to apply it everywhere, you would actually almost abolish refugee protection. So there is something that should give us pause to think about it. Of course, human smuggling and trafficking issues have to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. Lives have to be saved. But it must not be done at the expense of asylum seekers and refugees, who often have no choice but to travel across borders, sometimes and very often, in fact, without permission. In this process, some of the ethical and legal underpinnings of asylum and the 51 Refugee Convention have been lost. So how did we get to such a place in the treatment of refugees? And how can we ensure that border protection, combating smuggling, saving lives at sea, delivering protection and solutions to refugees do not come across as incompatible goals, but as a coherent whole? How do we get to that? How do we get out of this conundrum, and how do we square the circle? And not just here in Australia, increasingly in many other parts of the world as well. And now I would like to focus on some of those global and regional developments. But at the basis of it, we need to recognize that refugees are here to stay. They are a fact of life. They are a reality of life. And it's better to address that head on rather than ignoring it. I remember last year during the Europe crisis, the chair of the EU Foreign Affairs Committee in a public meeting was saying that we have realized that given the fact that we had 1 million arrivals with 500 million people living in the EU who are EU citizens, that indeed the fact that refugees are here now changes our political priorities. It changes the way we have to deal with it. It may not have been a priority with the numbers that have decreased, but of course now it is to be a priority where the resources have to go and be dealing with. And I think if we recognize as the premise, it is also clear that we have to deal with it with a deep sense of humanity, with a deep sense of empathy for the human beings that are faced with these challenges. And in the discussion, we also know that security considerations often come into play in many countries around the world. We also know that security cannot be done without the protection of refugees, and we need to integrate both dimensions much more. Let me now situate the discussion and some of the dilemmas that arise as a result, including here in Australia, but also in Southeast Asia, more broadly within the larger picture on refugee protection. And I would like to offer some reflections on the way forward, very much informed by the New York Declaration. I'm sure throughout today you probably have heard a lot about the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, but actually this is, certainly from our perspective, a real glimmer of hope. We are living at a time where we face very stark contrasts in the face of change and crisis. And there are essentially two tendencies. One is going into isolationism, inwardness, and to some extent indifference. On the other hand, we have also outpouring of sympathies, of empathy, of generosity, and sometimes at the very basic level. I remember in Tunisia in 2011, when the Libya crisis started, I had a chance to visit host communities, Tunisian host communities, offering Libyans their homes. They actually opened their homes. There was none of us from the international community were there. They did it on their own because they felt that that was their duty. They felt very close to the people who were arriving, and as a result, they showed that generosity. We have seen a similar outpouring of generosity also in Europe. I must say I was personally surprised because I know that this very strong sense of helping very much in often the most impoverished countries of the world. But actually, it was interesting to see also in Europe that there was a lot of volunteerism, there was a lot of attempts to really help, sometimes not because they were organized in any way, but they saw how people in which predicament they were, and as a result decided to help. I think it's very similar here in Australia. I've met a lot of people in Australia who do everything in order to help refugees, both the ones who are resettled in this country, but also the ones who are now often in a very precarious situation. And we know that the reality will stay because some of the conflicts that have been there for some time, unfortunately, we have not seen a resolution to them. I mean, of course, it's Iraq. It's, as you know, Mosul. The Mosul offensive is happening as we speak. It has already led to the internal displacement of over 50,000 people. Syria, we hear in the news, Aleppo. There are many other parts of Syria where for some people it is actually impossible to leave. The most fervent wish they have is actually to leave their current predicament, but they are almost encircled and they are beleaguered, and they are living in enclaves where humanitarian access has been an impossibility. We know that in a number of situations in Africa, South Sudan, for example, the situation is actually deteriorating. You probably heard the special advisor of the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide has just come back from a visit to South Sudan, and he was extremely concerned about the inter-ethnic tensions that he saw in the country. We know that this reality is reflected in the numbers. 65 million people displaced as a result of conflict, persecution, and human rights violations. 40 million internally displaced, and over 21.3 million refugees. And it's clear, for them, escape has become a necessity and a means for survival, in fact, for millions. When confronted with this reality, we have also noticed that some in wealthier nations, in the industrialized world, have chosen the path of retreat, looking inwards. And nowhere is this more evident than in the rising populism and xenophobia that we see in different parts of the world. One of the outcomes of the 19th September summit that led to the adoption of the New York Declaration was actually a campaign that the Secretary General wants to launch against xenophobia because he saw this as a global phenomenon that needs to be addressed urgently. Some of these tendencies we have seen as a reflection in policy and legal changes, essentially in non-entree policies in some parts of the world. And some of these policies actually had the effect of vilifying refugees for trying to survive through flight. These policies are sometimes enacted in the name of border protection. They call actually into question what really is at stake. What protection are we talking about? Is it border protection or is it protection of people? And somehow we are led to believe that these are incompatible goals. Well, they are not. They actually need to go in hand. And it's very important that we find ways and means to address it in the face of the reality that most people who try to flee, it is actually almost impossible for them to do this through regular pathways. Very often it is happening in an irregular manner. And actually the drafters of the 1951 Convention, knowing very well in the wake of the Second World War and the experiences, the horrific experiences that many people, millions of people went through during the Second World War, they knew that you cannot get your documents necessarily, and you cannot necessarily go to the neighboring countries in order to find safety. Sometimes you have to move on. That was the experience, and this is why in one particular article of the 1951 Convention, you have reflection of this. It actually talks about unlawful stay or entry. And it means that the drafters of the convention, back in 1950, 1949, 1950, 51, they actually saw that as a reality that had to be dealt with. We also see, when we talk about bilateral transfer arrangements, if they do not have a multilaterally agreed solutions framework in place, that, or with arbitrary detention that happens, or with lack of opportunities for refugees to reunite with their families, that such policies can have the effect of punishing and penalizing their victims. And for us, that's very difficult, because these are people who survived conflict, who survived human rights violations. They are actually victims of human rights violations and violence. And when they try to seek safety, the last thing they want is to be doubly victimized. I think that's very important when it comes to protection and when it comes to how countries deal with this phenomenon. So, inadvertently, policies of deterrence can lead to policies of mistreatment and punishment. And there is, I think, one grading or one way, one scaling that we can see, and one has to be very, very careful about this. And sometimes it has to do with the phenomenon of dehumanization. I must say, I just came back from Rwanda, and one of the visits I did was to go to the Memorial Center for Genocide. And if you look at how insidiously the process of dehumanization works, I mean, you could see it through the testimonies of some of the victims who survived, and how it all started. It is this process of dehumanization that we see in many, many conflicts around the world. We see this as one of the main reasons why people are leaving. In fact, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross once told us that in his discussions with governments about international humanitarian law, some parties to a conflict would say to him, well, it's fine to have international humanitarian law. Indeed, it applies to human beings, but we are talking about animals here. You can see the dehumanization that is so deep in some of these conflicts around the world, which propel people to flee, which is their only chance of survival. The dehumanization of the other, unfortunately, is also a phenomenon, in some instances, has become a phenomenon in the industrialized world. I think we should be very wary of such tendencies. And indeed, it poses risks almost everywhere in the world. Of course, the scale is different and can't be compared, but dehumanization is about not seeing the other as a human being, not necessarily putting an identity to that person through a very reductionist approach. It means embracing the individual in his or her richness, diversity, and openness. And whatever we do with certain individuals, human beings, we may do to ourselves. And I think that's where we need to understand much better what dehumanization means, both for those who flee it in conflict situations, but also when they end up sometimes in the industrialized world, in refugee hosting countries, where they may face this similar phenomenon of not being seen as human beings. We also know that as a result of this, the modern institution of asylum was built. It was created in that spirit as a response to people who flee such circumstances, as a lifeline of support to them. And we also know that it in a way forms the rule of law basis of today's engagement with refugees. But what we also notice, there's sometimes a bit of a questioning about the rule of law basis of it. And there are concepts of arbitrariness and discretion that feed into some of the policies. And discretion, quite frankly, is often an area where indeed we get quite worried because we don't know what discretion means and what is the rule of law basis behind it. And it allows sometimes a slippage from international cooperation and solidarity. It promotes almost an exceptionalism and self-interest. And it is important within this discussion to go back to the sound legal basis that is enshrined in the 51 Convention, in its standards. It allows a practical and principled approach. It has saved millions of lives over decades. It's an instrument that has proven its adaptability over time. It evolves to respond to changing circumstances, has embraced gender persecution, for example, the persecution based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It has embraced situations of people that flee violence and conflict. So it is indeed a tool that provides checks and balances of how to respond in a humane way. So in all of this, what does the New York Declaration have to say? And there is one area where the New York Declaration that was adopted on the 19th of September this year, actually at the leaders level by all 193 member states of the United Nations, it was clear that that declaration put forward a reaffirmation of the legal principles. It put forward a reaffirmation of the 1951 Convention, of the international protection framework that applies. And it also, when it comes to refugees, wants to address a particular gap that we in UNHCR have found to be one of the most crucial ones to fill. It's about burden and responsibility sharing. That's what the text says. Of course, we prefer the term responsibility sharing, and in fact, opportunity sharing, as one of the participants once said, it's about sharing of opportunities. But it's for the first time that in a declaration of the General Assembly by all leaders of the world, all 193 leaders, that declaration got adopted. And we actually think, for us, despite some of the retreats that we see when it comes to multilateralism, that it is a glimmer of hope for multilateralism, because it recognizes the issue that needs to be dealt with. It recognizes refugees in their plight. It puts forward responses. It also puts forward the idea that a country on its own cannot resolve refugee issues, especially when countries are faced with a large-scale influx or with a protected refugee situations. And as a result, from our perspective, it is quite a remarkable achievement that this declaration got adopted by the GA at a time when some countries were calling for a revisiting of the 1951 Convention. And when some of those wanted to do away with the legal distinctions among different people on the move, and as a result do away with the refugee category. So it was for us a refreshing surprise that this declaration got adopted. What does it do for us concretely? Because of course, at the moment it is a paper. It's a paper that needs to be brought to life. But it does put forward the idea of profound solidarity, more than ever any document before. And those of you who are the lawyers will know that there is a slight difference between a resolution of the GA and a declaration of the GA, especially when it gets adopted at the leaders level. I know that some, and maybe even in the course of today, I don't know, have critiqued the declaration as nothing more than the status quo. But actually, what for us it does, it tries to ensure that people, when they come to a territory, that they are properly received, that they're registered, that they are identified, that we know their needs, that we know who they actually are, that we know those who are particularly vulnerable and those who have particular needs. It puts forward the idea of contingency planning. We need to be prepared. That was one of the big issues in Europe last year. Europe wasn't prepared, despite the fact that I think many of us saw it coming. It also wants to make sure that the development aspects of how we deal with the humanitarian responses come in much earlier. One of the big lessons that we have learned over the years is the parallelism in how we respond to refugees. On the one hand, you have almost an infrastructure that is directly affected by large-scale influxes. Just think of Lebanon. Lebanon, a country of 4.5 million people. Within a couple of years, you had over 1.1 million Syrian refugees in that country. You can imagine what this means for us. A quarter of the country are refugees. Of course, it affects education and health systems and water systems. The same in Jordan. With a population of about 8 million, you have suddenly 600,000 Syrian refugees in a country that is so scarce when it comes to water. Or in Turkey, a country that has opened itself to Syrian refugees, over 2.7 million. Of course it affects schooling, access to education, health infrastructure. And there is always the tendency to create almost a parallel system for the refugees. What this declaration does is put forward a much stronger engagement by development actors and much earlier on. I know that this is not going to be easy because we have been talking about the humanitarian development nexus for quite some time. But we have never heard the president of the World Bank in September make the type of statements he did. He was very, very strong. He was very committed to working on forced displacement issues. And in fact, there's a paper that the World Bank had just launched in September about forced displacement and how indeed one should take into account, including in middle-income countries, the fact that some are more affected than others, that there is sizable populations that come in where indeed this needs to be taken into account in any development approach. So that, I think, gives us some hope. It also gives us hope in the Sustainable Development Agenda 2020-30 that some of the goals, you will see, they don't actually mention refugees. Well, you can say they may mention refugees because no one is to be left behind. No one means no one, including refugees. At the same time, there's no clear language about them. So the New York Declaration will help us ensure that refugees will be considered as part of national development plannings, and that's extremely important. In fact, there is one country that has actually adopted this as an approach. It's Uganda. Uganda has this ReHope planning tool for essentially allowing refugees to be integrated into their national development programming. And Uganda is a country that is currently hosting the largest number of refugees on the African continent. I think it's close to 700,000. And they are faced with an ongoing refugee influx from South Sudan. So it actually shows if there is the willingness, if there is the interest on the part of the international community. In fact, the World Bank is very much engaged by providing funds and loans. There's the whole idea of concessional loans that has emerged as one way to respond to countries that are responding to large-scale influxes, and Uganda in a way is a very good example of how it can work. And so the New York Declaration and the annex that develops this comprehensive refugee response framework does some of the things that we have been hoping for quite some time. It bridges the humanitarian and development areas. It looks at some of the private sector engagement. That's another discovery. And I understand the Australian Bureau for Statistics, in fact, in its analysis, there's a recent analysis where it puts forward that some of all the people who arrive in Australia, refugees are the most entrepreneurial. So it shows that one can use some of the contributions and show that the contributions that refugees make to host societies, if the right investments are made early on, for example, through language training, allowing access to education, giving them a sense of stability, making sure that they have access to employment, that you can actually come to a win-win situation. You can see refugees contributing and wanting to contribute to host communities, including by paying taxes. must say I met today in Brisbane a family that is on this bridging visa. I heard about the bridging visa. I've never seen the effects of it, but I was quite distraught by what I heard about the instability that people are put in, where you hear the woman talk about having to have her birth induced because she was afraid that she may not actually be able to renew her temporary permit. And I must say it worried me that such things can happen, where indeed the contrary needs to happen when it comes to refugees. I mean, refugees are people who want to contribute, and certainly that's the very strong impression that I got from that particular family, but they're still on a bridging visa. And that's certainly not, from our perspective, in any way one response that would help to advance refugee protection, the integration of refugees, or finding solutions for them. And it's clear that I was also very encouraged by the Australians who were helping this family, because that's yet another element of the New York Declaration. It talks about a whole of society approach. Of course, the governments are very important, but so are faith communities, so are volunteers, so are NGO networks, so are academic communities. And it's interesting that the New York Declaration for the first time talked not just about a whole of government approach, but about a whole of society approach, meaning that everyone comes together. And I see there are also some, you are actually going to school, I think. It's good that you learn about this, because you may actually have refugees at school, and it's good to know about who they are and to learn about them. So it includes not just those who are in governance, UNHCR, those who are working for international organizations, but includes each and every one of us. And that's what the New York Declaration does. It recognizes this as one way of responding. So what are the next steps? We were tasked, UNHCR was tasked to learn from how we implement this comprehensive refugee response, both in large-scale influx situations as well as in protracted situations. And as you know, a lot of refugee situations are protracted. They last sometimes for decades, as we could see with the Afghan situation, with the Somalia situation. I mean, refugees have been in the neighboring countries not just for years, but for decades. And sometimes they go back and they have to flee again. And so we want to apply this in a number of situations and learn from its application, using the New York Declaration as an element for that. We don't have much time, because it has to happen in 2017, and the High Commissioner appointed a whole task team doing this. We have already identified some countries. Tanzania is one, Uganda is another one, and I'm here with the director of the UNHCR Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, and we were also thinking about maybe looking at Southeast Asia and seeing whether the New York Declaration, and by the way, the Bali Ministerial Declaration that was adopted earlier this year, which has also some interesting protection language, not just law enforcement, it's also about protection, to actually use this and see whether there is a different way of engagement in Southeast Asia that is possible as a result of these declarations, but also including in these discussions Australia. I think that would be very important. By the way, on the private sector, I forgot to mention one important thing. Because the private sector, we see there is growing realization that indeed refugees actually make a contribution. Often it's the employers' federations that come forward and want to see government changes, because they know what value refugees have. And you may have heard about George Soros, who just dedicated $500 million to innovative projects where, through some small-scale funding, the private sector, you can come to these win-win situations where it's about employment of both refugees and hosting communities, because I think that's another very important factor in the New York Declaration, that it is not just about refugees, it is also about the host communities, that the host communities get the support that they need, because they do, especially when large numbers come in, as I was mentioning about Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon or Uganda or Ethiopia. It's clear that the host communities are affected, so we need to support them as well. I think this is what we need to do in terms of implementation, and we hope that based on the practical experience that we have gained from the comprehensive refugee response, that we will actually be able to develop a global compact for refugees in 2018. I mean, that's the idea. You may have heard about two global compacts. One is about safe, orderly, and regular migration, and the other one is about refugees. In fact, we were tasked to develop the Global Compact for Refugees, building on this comprehensive refugee response, but also building on the input that we get from all of you. I think it would be interesting if you could share interesting examples of how things can work better for refugees and for host communities. So maybe some of these ideas could at least be discussed and then at some stage feed into this process of developing the Global Compact. So that's what I would like, perhaps one point on the Global Compact on migration, because I understand you have heard about it during the day and discussed it as well. I mean, you had François Crépeau here after all, who is the Special Rapporteur on migration within the UN Human Rights Council. We are also very interested from a refugee perspective to work with the countries that are going to develop the Global Compact on migration. And I'm saying this because we also know that in many situations we have mixed flows. Some of the refugees use the same travel routes as the migrants. They're actually faced sometimes with the same life issues, because when you're on a boat, it doesn't matter whether you're a refugee or a migrant. Your primary interest is to save your lives. And it's not just about people at sea. It is also people who cross the desert. We actually do not know the numbers of people who come through West Africa trying to go through Libya, sometimes, well, through Mali, Libya, upwards, how many of them actually die as a result. We have had one of the highest death tolls on the Mediterranean this year, over 4,500 people who tried to cross, especially the central Mediterranean. So it's clear that in this discussion, it is important to look at both migration and refugee issues, know about the linkages, know also about what we can learn from each other, but at the same time ensuring that the very specific legal regime that was created for refugees is actually honored, respected, and properly implemented. One area, and you have mentioned it, climate change, is also, I understand, one of these global challenges that the university is working on. It obviously also speaks to displacement and migration issues. So I guess that some of the displacement-related effects of climate change will also find its reflection in either both or either of the compacts. There is an interesting development that took place last year. The Nansen Protection Agenda was adopted by over 100 states, endorsed in fact. It's a protection agenda for people who cross international borders as a result of climate change. And quite frankly, in our work, we see very often these interlinkages. Just to give you an example, and it doesn't mean that these are the reasons why people flee, but in Syria, we had water scarcity and drought for quite some time before the conflict broke out. And sometimes we have seen this in Sudan, in Somalia, but also in Syria, that scarcity of resources, the competition over land and resources can obviously also lead to conflict and violence. We know that climate change and environmental degradation are factors that influence displacement. We know that migration is an adaptation strategy. In fact, that's the only way for people to survive. They migrate somewhere else. In fact, that has happened ever since humanity started. It's a phenomenon of human mobility because it's a survival mechanism. But we do need to know much more about it and the consequences of displacement. And I know that Professor Jane McAdam has worked a lot on this, has written books about it and articles. It's a very important contribution because it will certainly have an influence in the debates about both global compacts. But, and this is my last point, of course, the New York Declaration is a very important launching pad for us. But the real challenge, I think, really is how we bring life to the fundamental humanitarian values that underlie refugee protection. how we bring life and empathy for the individual human being, how we manage to instill this deep sense of humanity, and how we can change politics of turning them from inwardness to outwardness, from embracing diversity and richness to a constructive engagement of politics of tomorrow. And I think that's really the challenge for all of us, and I'm much looking forward to having an exchange of views with you about that. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and President of UNSW, Professor Ian Jacobs, who's currently on an international flight, which is why he's not here, and the rest of the leadership of UNSW, and of course everybody here tonight, please accept our heartfelt thanks for presenting the inaugural lecture for the UNSW Grand Challenge on Refugees and Migrants. It has been both a professional and a personal pleasure to be able to welcome you here and to hear your characteristically astute, pertinent observations about the challenging issues that preoccupy much of the world, whether for better or for worse. Your insights come from both a wealth of practical experience, but also, of course, from your deep understanding of international law, your forensic legal skills of analysis, your keen sense of diplomacy, your keen sense of humanity, and your reflective approach. What I particularly admire and appreciate, What I particularly admire and appreciate is your ability to offer optimism and leadership at a time when there is so much negativity and anxiety. Tonight, you have shown us how the international protection regime has the capacity to respond to displacement in a timely and effective manner to assist the very many people who need its sanctuary. You and your colleagues at UNHCR all over the world are at the forefront of protection, and you understand what it means in all its dimensions, as you've explained tonight. Whether it be the importance of strong legal safeguards, the assurance of physical security, the provision of shelter, education, livelihoods and assistance, or access to meaningful and durable solutions. We thank all of you for your perseverance and your determination, and for upholding the importance of protection for people whose own countries can no longer or will no longer provide it. So Volker, on behalf of UNSW, please accept this small token of our appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, Volker mentioned in his talk the importance of a whole-of-society approach, and I think within our audience tonight we certainly have that. We have professionals, we have school students, we have retirees, we have members of international organisations, government representatives, members of the university community. I could go on and on. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to take our own role in this and go forward and promote the protection principles that we've heard so much about. Thank you very, very much for coming along. I'd particularly like to thank the people at UNSW who helped make this event happen. Renee Falvey, Hannah Turnbull, Vanessa Carley, Claire Morgan, Kelly Newell and Frances Voon in particular. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and that we see you back at more events in the future. Good night.